Have you ever felt like an old wound still lives inside you, even if it doesn't show? Trauma isn't just something that happens to you. It's something that stays with you, shaping how you think, feel, and even how you live in your own skin. But what is trauma, really? Bessel von der Kolk, in his groundbreaking work, The Body Keeps the Score, lays bare the profound truth that trauma isn't just something we think about. It's something we feel deeply and inescapably in our bodies. Far from being confined to the mind, trauma imprints itself on our physiology, changing the way we experience the world. It rewires the brain, reshapes the nervous system, and alters the body's ability to regulate itself. Chapter 1. Understanding trauma's grip on the mind and body. For many, trauma becomes a ghost that lingers long after the event, haunting them with physical sensations and emotional echoes they cannot fully understand or control. Consider the case of someone who has survived a violent mugging. Even months or years later, the slam of a door or the sudden appearance of a stranger in their peripheral vision can trigger a cascade of reactions: a racing heart, shallow breathing, or an overwhelming sense of dread. These reactions are not deliberate, they are automatic. As von der Kolk explains, trauma hijacks key parts of the brain, particularly the amygdala, the center of fear and emotional processing. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thought and emotional regulation, becomes underactive, leaving the person stuck in a reactive state. This creates a body that is constantly on edge, as if the trauma is happening all over again. Trauma doesn't just invade the individual, however. Judith Herman, in her equally influential Trauma and Recovery, extends the conversation to consider how trauma functions on a broader societal scale. Herman emphasizes that trauma exists on a continuum, from the intimate wounds of personal violence, such as domestic abuse, to the sweeping devastation of collective events like war, natural disasters, or systemic oppression. This framework helps us understand why trauma is so pervasive and difficult to escape. It's not just about what happens to one person. It's also about how the world around them responds, or fails to respond. For instance, imagine a refugee fleeing their home due to political violence. While the immediate trauma of war or persecution may dominate their experience, they also face new layers of disconnection upon reaching safety. Language barriers, cultural differences, and systemic neglect can compound their trauma, making them feel alienated from both their old world and their new one. Herman argues that this disconnection is one of trauma's most insidious effects. It severs the bonds between people and their communities, leaving them isolated, unseen, and unsupported. Van der Kolk's work reveals that this disconnection extends inward as well. Trauma can disrupt a person's relationship with their own body. Survivors often feel as though their body has betrayed them, whether through flashbacks, panic attacks, or chronic physical pain. This sense of betrayal can make it difficult for survivors to trust themselves, let alone others. As a result, they may withdraw, turning to coping mechanisms that numb their pain but further disconnect them from the world around them. But what causes trauma to take hold in some people, while others seem more resilient? Van der Kolk and Herman both point to the importance of support systems and safety. A child who experiences abuse, but has a trusted adult to confide in, may fare better than one who faces their trauma alone. Similarly, a community that acknowledges and addresses collective trauma, such as post-apartheid South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, can foster healing in ways that silence and denial cannot. Trauma also thrives on invisibility. Herman makes a compelling case that trauma often exists in a cultural context of denial, particularly when it comes to systemic violence. Survivors of domestic abuse, for example, may be dismissed or disbelieved, while victims of political terror may be silenced by governments eager to maintain control. This lack of recognition only deepens the trauma, reinforcing the survivor's sense of alienation and powerlessness. To heal from trauma, then, we must address both its internal and external dimensions. Kolk advocates for approaches that reconnect survivors with their bodies, such as yoga, meditation, and somatic therapies. These practices help to calm the overactive amygdala and restore the brain's ability to regulate itself. Meanwhile, Herman emphasizes the importance of breaking silence and creating spaces for survivors to share their stories. This can happen on an individual level, such as in therapy, or on a collective level through social movements and public acknowledgement of harm. Trauma's grip is powerful, but it is not unbreakable. By understanding how it embeds itself in both the mind and the body, and by addressing the social structures that perpetuate it, we can begin to loosen its hold. Kolk and Herman remind us that healing is not just about undoing the damage, it's about rebuilding connection, both with ourselves and with the world around us. Chapter 2. The Invisible Wounds of Trauma. Kolk's and Herman's groundbreaking works highlight a profound truth. While physical injuries often heal with time, the wounds left by trauma are far more insidious and enduring. These wounds, psychological, emotional, and often hidden from view, shape how survivors see themselves, others, and the world around them. The challenge is that these scars often go unrecognized, both by survivors themselves and by those around them. This invisibility makes trauma uniquely difficult to address, perpetuating cycles of pain and misunderstanding. Imagine a child who has experienced neglect or emotional abuse. As they grow, they may struggle with feelings of worthlessness or a pervasive sense of mistrust in relationships. They might not connect these struggles to their early experiences, instead internalizing a belief that something is inherently wrong with them. Kolk describes this phenomenon as developmental trauma, where a lack of safety, love, or consistency during formative years disrupts the brain's ability to regulate emotions and form secure attachments. For these individuals, the world often feels unpredictable and dangerous, leaving them in a constant state of vigilance or emotional shutdown. This isn't just a psychological phenomenon, it's biological. Kolk explains how trauma alters the brain's wiring, particularly in regions like the amygdala and hippocampus. The amygdala becomes hyperactive, constantly scanning for threats, while the hippocampus, the area responsible for distinguishing between past and present, often struggles to do its job. As a result, survivors may feel as though they are reliving their trauma, even in safe situations, further perpetuating cycles of fear, avoidance, and emotional withdrawal. Judith Herman takes this understanding of invisible wounds a step further, exploring how trauma's invisibility is compounded by societal neglect. When trauma stems from systemic oppression, domestic violence, or political violence, survivors face not only the internal struggles described by Kolk, but also the external burden of being disbelieved or ignored. For instance, a survivor of domestic abuse may encounter a justice system that questions their credibility, or a culture that stigmatizes them for speaking out. Similarly, survivors of political violence or war often experience erasure as governments or institutions seek to downplay their suffering for the sake of maintaining power or avoiding accountability. Herman argues that this lack of societal recognition is itself a form of re-traumatization. Without acknowledgement, survivors are left feeling isolated, as though their experiences are invalid or unworthy of attention. This sense of invisibility can deepen their pain, making recovery an uphill battle. Imagine a refugee who has fled war and resettled in a foreign country. While they may no longer face immediate threats, they might struggle with a profound sense of disconnection. Language barriers, cultural differences, and a lack of support can reinforce their feeling of being othered, compounding the trauma they already carry. For survivors of trauma, this invisibility extends inward. Many internalize their pain, convinced that their struggles are a personal failing rather than a natural response to extraordinary circumstances. They might avoid seeking help, either out of shame or because they've been conditioned to believe that their pain isn't valid. This can manifest in subtle but profound ways. Difficulty forming close relationships, chronic health issues, or an overwhelming sense of numbness that makes it hard to feel joy, sadness, or connection. Herman and van der Kolk agree that healing begins with acknowledgement. For individuals, this means recognizing how trauma has shaped their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without judgment or blame. For societies, it requires creating spaces where survivors' voices can be heard and their experiences validated. Herman points to examples like truth and reconciliation commissions, which provide platforms for survivors to share their stories and hold systems accountable. These acts of acknowledgement, while not a panacea, are powerful first steps toward healing, both for individuals and for the communities they belong to. The invisible wounds of trauma may not be easy to see, but their impact is profound. They shape how survivors navigate their daily lives, how they view themselves, and how they connect with others. By bringing these wounds to light, through empathy, understanding, and systemic change, we can begin to break the silence that allows trauma to fester. In doing so, we not only support survivors in their healing, but also create a world where pain is met with compassion rather than indifference. Chapter 3. The Path to Healing. Healing from trauma, as van der Kolk explains, requires more than just talking about it. The body, which has carried the burden of trauma, must also be involved in the recovery process. Practices like yoga, mindfulness, and somatic therapies can help survivors reconnect with their physical selves, allowing them to release the stored tension and fear that trauma imprints. Imagine a veteran returning from combat who struggles with flashbacks and nightmares. Traditional talk therapy might help them process their experiences, but incorporating practices like controlled breathing or movement therapy can further support their recovery by calming the nervous system and restoring a sense of safety in their body. Van der Kolk's work emphasizes that trauma recovery is not a one-size-fits-all process. It requires understanding the unique interplay between the brain, mind, and body for each individual. Herman also emphasizes the role of community in healing. Trauma, especially when it stems from interpersonal violence or systemic oppression, thrives in silence. By breaking that silence, through storytelling, activism, or creating spaces where survivors feel heard and validated, healing can occur. Herman highlights that recovery is not just about returning to a normal state, but about reclaiming power and reestablishing connections. Chapter 4. Trauma and the human experience. At its core, the psychology of trauma is about the profound impact of suffering on the human spirit and the incredible resilience that can emerge in its aftermath. Van der Kolk and Herman both underscore that trauma is not simply a story of pain, it's also a story of survival. Even in the face of profound adversity, people find ways to endure, adapt, and sometimes even grow stronger. Take, for example, the concept of post-traumatic growth. Someone who has survived a life-altering event, such as a natural disaster or a personal loss, might find themselves reevaluating their priorities, deepening their relationships, or discovering new sources of meaning. Van der Kolk describes this as the body and mind's ability to heal, given the right tools and support. Herman, meanwhile, explores the societal implications of trauma. She argues that recognizing trauma on a collective level, whether through public acknowledgement of historical injustices or systemic reforms, can pave the way for broader healing. This idea is particularly relevant in today's world, where many communities are grappling with the aftermath of generational trauma, systemic inequities, and global crises. Together, van der Kolk and Herman remind us that trauma, while deeply personal, is also a shared human experience. By understanding its impact, addressing its roots, and fostering spaces for healing, we can create a world where individuals and communities alike can recover and thrive.